Alright guys, we are back in my garage for another video, and today we are going to be upgrading the cams and valve springs on my B58 engine. You guys might remember a couple months ago we talked about the new Kelford cams that were coming on the market when they officially announced all the specs and different options that were going to be available, and they agreed to send me out a set so that I could create some content for you guys, show you how it's all installed, and we'll also do some testing with it to see how much power the car will put down even on just a stock turbo setup. So I got the Stage 1 Gen 1 B58 upgraded camshafts along with the valve springs, and we're going to be doing this in like a 4-part series. So part 1 will show you how to install the intake cam, part 2 will be the exhaust cam, and then part 3 will be the valve springs. And in the future, we'll do a part 4 to show the actual results. We'll get on the dyno, do some custom tuning, and all of that good stuff. So yeah, stick around for all of those videos. Keep in mind, if you've been around on the channel for a while, you know I try to create these DIYs to show you how easy it is to install different parts on your car and what you can do from home. This might not be the case, I'll be completely honest. It was a little tricky. It requires a lot of specialty tools, so this might just give you some motivation to drop it off at a shop. But either way, I thought it would be cool to show you guys how it's done. So yeah, hopefully you find this video useful. Now, as always, for everybody that's new to the channel, I create these videos to help keep you updated on the latest developments in our community, as well as discuss technical topics so that we have a better understanding of how our engines work. So if you're interested in more videos like that, be sure to subscribe because there will be a lot more coming out in the future. Now, you guys might be wondering why I'm doing this mod or how you would know if it's necessary for your B58 build. In my case, I am running the Kelford upgraded Stage 1 intake and exhaust camshafts. Now, even though they're only the Stage 1 versions, they still run a more aggressive profile than the OEM cams. And because of that, if you don't upgrade to a stiffer spring, you can potentially run into valve float issues. And valve float happens when the cam profile pushes down on the spring and returns so fast that the spring can't keep up, and it creates a small gap between the cam and the spring that isn't ideal because basically that means that the valve is open when it shouldn't be, and that can cause a lot of issues, including engine damage. So at this point, if you are doing an upgraded intake and exhaust cam like the Kelford versions, then it is 100% required that you upgrade your valve springs. If you're only doing one of the lift kits that only modify the fuel lobe for your high pressure fuel pump, then this isn't needed. This is only for upgraded cams that increase the airflow through the cylinder head, not the cams that increase your fuel system's limits. So we're going to go ahead and swap the intake and exhaust cams. I've already posted DIYs on both of those. If you need help with that, check out the videos in the description, and then we will move on to swapping the valve springs. So at this point, you've already removed your intake and exhaust cams, and now we only need to remove the eccentric shaft. It's held in place by these cam bridges that hold up the intake cam, and then there's also one additional bearing at the front that has 2 screws, so you don't need to remove them in any particular order. Just unscrew all of the screws, and then you can pull all the caps off. Now, like I said, these ledges that are holding the intake cam in place only have 1 screw on one side, so the other side does have a dowel that kind of locates it, and that means that you need to take it off a little bit gently. Don't wiggle it too hard or pull too hard because you could potentially damage that dowel, which will prevent you from locating it properly when you reinstall. So just take your time, wiggle it gently until it pops off, and then you'll be able to fully remove the eccentric shaft. And of course, just like with the cams, you want to lay out all of the components in order so that you can reinstall it in the same sequence and the same orientation. Next, we're going to unbox the valve spring kit from Kelford. The springs themselves are pretty straightforward. There are 24, one for each of the valves, and they're all the same, so they're all just kind of packaged together. However, the spring retainers are different on the intake and the exhaust side. The intake valves are thinner than the exhaust valves, so you can see the holes on the intake retainers is smaller than the holes on the exhaust retainers. Also, you can see that the intake retainers are kind of convex and poke out, while the exhaust retainers are concave and kind of get sucked in. So even if you mix them up, you can tell the difference between them just by looking at them visually. Now, we don't want the valves to fall into the cylinder when we're compressing the springs, so this is the tool that I'm going to be using to keep the valves in place. I basically took a braided line and added an air hose connection to one side, and I took an adapter from my compression tester and screwed that onto the other side so that it can fit in my spark plug hole. And we're just going to screw it directly into the hole itself, and then I'll connect the other line to my air compressor. We'll pressurize the cylinder, and that will help keep the valves in place. Now, of course, we want to minimize the leakage here. Some air is going to leak by no matter what, but just to minimize it, we're also going to put an injector in the hole, because otherwise there's a huge leak where a bunch of air is going to be coming out. After that, we're going to remove all of the rockers and the lifters. This is super simple because the lifters are clipped onto the rockers, so when you pull the rockers straight up, you'll pull the lifters with it. If the lifter doesn't come out, you can still pull it out individually and just kind of clip it back onto the rocker itself. But yeah, just like everything else, set it aside in the same order so you can install it in the same location it was in. Now, for the valve spring compressor tool, you need a counter hold, and pretty much any of the holes on your cylinder head will work. I'm using one of the screws that are used to hold on our fuel rail. If you have a different screw that fits one of the threads, feel free to use that as well. This one was just convenient for me, so I'm using that one. Keep in mind, this is probably going to bend the screw a little bit, so you might want to buy a spare or at least a replacement so that you can use that screw for reinstallation. And this is what the universal valve spring compressor looks like. And this is the tool that I will have linked down in the description if you want to use it. But basically, you just hook it underneath that screw, and then you put the adapter on top of the valve, and then you can compress the valve spring. Now here you can see the whole valve is moving down with the spring, so I didn't have enough air in my compressor. So I turned up the PSI to about 75, and that helped avoid that issue. So we're back for round two. Hook the valve spring tool underneath the screw, put it on top of the valve spring, and when I push down, now only the spring is compressing. Now, when you do this, you want to have a magnet ready because you're going to need to get those keepers out. These are the most annoying parts of the job. I'm probably going to rant about this a little bit, but use your magnet to get those out when you have the spring compressed, and then slowly release tension so that the spring can be removed along with the OEM retainer. Then you're going to grab one of the springs from your Kelford kit. Keep in mind these only go on one way, so put the big flat end down towards the valve, and then you're going to go and get one of your exhaust retainers. In this case, we're grabbing the concave one since we're on the exhaust side, and you're going to center that on the valve spring and kind of locate everything so that you're ready to compress the spring and reinstall your keepers. Now, next you need to compress the valve spring so that you can get the keepers back in place. And this is by far the most annoying part of the job. And yes, I'm going to rant a little bit, but these little pieces of automotive engineering are extremely difficult to work with. They're really small, so I got these tiny pliers to kind of put them in place and stage them up. But even when they're in place, they just do not want to go down into the hole. This would be a lot easier if you had like a static compressor so that you could at least use both hands to kind of try to put it in place. But even then, they're too small to really use your fingers, so you kind of got to wiggle it around with this pick tool to kind of try to get them to drop in. They can only go in one orientation because they are tapered, so you have to make sure that the short end or the low end goes in first. And somehow they are like spring loaded or something, so when you least expect it, you slightly adjust the compression on the valve spring, and they just pop off and go flying. And this actually caused a really bad time here. You can see, just as an example, it just pops out of place. And luckily, this one was right next to the valve spring, so I was able to just grab my magnet, pick it back up, and try again. But worst case scenario, it goes flying somewhere that you can't find. So I put a lot of shop towels everywhere just to try to avoid it going into the engine, which I found out the hard way it definitely can do. So yeah, you can see that was negligence on my part because I didn't have every single hole blocked off with a shop towel. So I just highly recommend, anywhere you see a hole like an oil return, a spark plug tube, fuel injector tube, anywhere where you don't want it to drop down, block it off. just avoid that issue because I literally lost it down one of my fuel injector tubes since I didn't have it blocked off. But there's no real rhyme or reason to why this is easy or hard. Obviously, the first time it was annoying and it popped out. Now the second time it just dropped right in. I don't know why. I've had one where I switched to my left hand and it just dropped in 15 seconds after fighting with it for like 20 minutes. So just take your time. I think one of the biggest contributors to my difficulty was when I wasn't compressing the spring enough. So make sure you compress it all the way down past the little keyed circles on the valve itself. That's where the keeper is going to sit in. So you need to compress it really low, and then you will slowly release it back up. The keepers will kind of locate themselves, and then they will hug the valve so that the spring stays under some tension. And this is how it will look when it's all done. So you should see both halves of the keeper fully seated in the retainers. They should be completely level with each other, so no like kind of angle or anything to it. So just do that 24 times, and then you'll be ready to reinstall. So now the installation is just the reverse of removal. We basically slid the lifters down into their holes and just make sure that the rockers are fitted on top of the valves properly. There's a little notch in the rocker that the valve should be sitting on, so make sure it's in there and not outside of the valve. Put it right in the center of that notch, and if you wiggle it a little bit, it should stay in place. Reinstalling the eccentric shaft is just like your cams. You want to make sure that you have all of the mating surfaces completely lubricated. So I'm using oil in my case. You can use a Simply Lube if you wish. Just make sure that you do an oil change within about 50 miles because that Assembly Lube will gum up your oil filter and kind of contaminates your oil. So you want to do more frequent oil changes to get that completely flushed out. But I'm just using oil since I was reinstalling everything and getting ready to start up the engine the same day. So yeah, oiled up all of the mating surfaces on the cylinder head, and then put oil all over all of the lobes and mating surfaces on the eccentric shaft. Make sure it's completely lubricated, and then you're going to reinstall that with extra attention to make sure the gear that's mating up with your Valvetronic motor is fully seated and the teeth are nestled into that kind of worm drive gear. Same thing goes for the cam bearing cap. So you're going to apply your oil or your assembly lube and put them back in their original location and orientation, and go ahead and torque down the screws. In this part, you're going to torque down the screws to 10 Newton meters. So there's no particular sequence or anything. So just tighten them all down, and then make sure that you turn your Valvetronic motor back to minimum lift again so that you're ready to reinstall your intake cam. And then after that, you're just going to reinstall everything else. So you put your exhaust cam and your intake cam back in. Again, I've got videos showing how to swap those in part 1 and 2 of this series, so feel free to go check those out if you need help getting everything reassembled. And then don't forget to give your car a couple cranks before you fully turn it over to help extra oil get to all of these new surfaces and keep it lubricated and safe on that first start. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it for this video. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope this helps. And if you have any other questions or comments, leave them down below. Okay.